So a couple of weeks ago I made a video on how I use drum samples to recover ambience on gated drums. And for anyone that hasn't seen that, I'll put a link up in the info card up in the top right corner. And this video is kind of a follow-up from that. And I had a number of emails after I uploaded that about, well, what samples do I use? And in that particular video I was using the Blackbird expansion for Trigger 2, and that's something that I use a lot. I also use sample libraries by the likes of That Sound and Get Good Drums, but to be honest, a lot of the time I actually end up making my own samples. And over the years, every time I've had a drummer in the studio and a different kit, I've taken the time to get them to hit each part of the kit individually and at multiple velocities to make my own samples. And I've built up a library of lots and lots of drums. And I've been lucky enough to have a bunch of top drummers and top kits in the studio. And I wanted to show you how I use these. So I'm basically going to give you 3 sets of drums today for free. So if you go to audioproductiontips.com and you go to the free stuff page, you'll find a sign up form there, and you can basically be sent all of these drum samples I'm going to use in this video for free. So what you're going to get is 3 sets of kicks and snares. So you're going to get a kind of more metal heavy trigger set, you're going to get a rock set, and you're also going to get these custom drum smash ambience trigger instruments. So these are going to be used for the purpose I explained in that last video. They're very artificial sounding, very sustained samples that you can kind of lengthen to the size that you need for your particular instance and for the track that you're working on. So let's just go ahead, and I want to play you some drums here with no samples on whatsoever. And these are some drums that I recorded a couple of weeks ago, and whilst they sound amazing, I think that I can make them sound even larger. So let's just listen to the raw sound first. And let's put the bass in. Okay, so they sound good, but we can get some extra consistency by using some close mic samples, and we can get some of that ambience and reinforcement on the sustain side from these ambient samples. So I've loaded up an instance of trigger on the kick, the snare, and the floor tom here, and we're just going to do each one individually. So let's just listen to the raw kick sound. Okay, so you can hear that there's not actually that much bleed in there already. You kind of hear some of the snare, but not a lot else. And this is because I kind of took a Queens of the Stone Age approach to recording these drums. And anyone that knows Songs for the Deaf will know that that album, they recorded the shell separately to the cymbals, and that enabled them to record in a much smaller room than you would usually record drums in, and it also allowed you to kind of process the raw sounds a bit further before you ended up with too much bleed. So that's what I've done here as well, but we can kind of take this a stage further. So I've got this kick trigger channel. Let's load up trigger here, and I'm just going to go to the browser, and I've already set it so that by default it goes to the directory where I've put the free sample pack in. And I'm going to show you the rock kit first. So what we've got inside here are 3 sets of folders. So we've got the rock trigger instrument. So this is where all of the individual files are. So we can see TCI files. So these are like files for each sample of each part of the kit. So we've got the floor tom, and we've got the room for it, the overheads, a mono overhead, and a crush. So you can blend these to taste. Or we've got a PRS file, which is a preset file. So these will come loaded with all of these in at various appropriate levels. So we've also then got, if you don't use trigger, then you can find all of the WAVs that I use to create these here. And if you're using Drumagog, you can make your own samples out of this. And then we've also got the one shot, so it's also fairly common, as well as having multiple velocity samples in something like Trigger or Drumagog. You might also want to just manually copy in one shots, which are just one particular velocity layer across the whole track to aid consistency. Okay, and what I've done is I've basically exported these as a one shot, so we can see that we've got a one shot of the kick ambience and snare ambience. We've got our one shots of the metal kick and snare, and we've got one of the rock kit. So using these, if you don't use Trigger or Drumagog, you can easily use these one shots and just copy them across. Okay, so we're just going to open the rock kit, and we're going to go to the Trigger instruments, and we're going to go kick. I'm going to load the preset up here. So that's loaded all of these individual sound files in, and they're kind of balanced to a level that I kind of like them. So let's just have a listen to that sample. Okay, so what you probably noticed there is that whilst it's treated nicely and there's been some subtractive EQing going on, I haven't gone through and done loads and loads of boosts in the top end, and I've not made it to the point where it could just be dropped into the track immediately. And the reason why is that I quite often like to put varying amounts of top end and bottom end dependent on the tempo of the song and also the arrangement. So I like to leave that stuff until I know the context of what I'm working on. So you'll find that these handle EQ and compression really well because there's not been a ton of processing done on the way in. So unlike some of the other sample libraries that you kind of just load it up and then it's kind of almost perfect, ready to go as long as you're picking the right sample for the right job, these just give you a little bit of extra room to kind of do what you want and add your own flavor to them. So let's just listen to that with the other kicks, and I'll turn it on and off. So probably what you're noticing there is the level of consistency that you're getting from adding that sample in, but at the same time, the way that I've processed these is it's not really taking the character away from the live drums, and that's really what I'm going for with a lot of the samples that I make, is I want them to kind of be fairly neutral and kind of fly under the radar a little bit more. And if I want to kind of give them that, sparkly, modern overall sound, then I can do that with EQ after the fact. So let's just move on to the snare now. Great, and again, I'm going to load the rock kit onto this, so the snare here. Great. Okay, so again, it's kind of slightly under-processed in a good way. You can hear that kind of mid-range ring still in the drum. Quite often you find that sort of stuff cleared up on the canned samples, and I kind of like to leave that in because sometimes that adds a kind of nice character to the drums that I want to keep, and sometimes I want to not keep it and just obliterate it, and sometimes even somewhere in between. So I like to keep that stuff in, and we can always EQ that afterwards. So let's just hear the kick and the snare together with those samples and without the samples. Okay, so that's got a lot of extra consistency. If this was something that I'd had the rest of the track finished, I might spend a bit of time tuning the snare drum here to a similar pitch to the natural one, but for the moment we're not going to worry about that. And what I want to do now is show you what I might do with the ambient samples. So let's just go back to the kick drum here, and to save time I'm not going to load a new instance. Okay, I'm just going to mute the other samples, and now I'm just going to go to the one shot here of the ambience here, and I just want this ambience to reinforce what the other sample is doing. So let's just load that in, and let's bring that all the way to 0, and let's just listen to what this ambient thing sounds like. Okay, so probably what you're hearing there is the reverb tail on it. You'll probably notice that it's not a completely natural kick drum sound. It's actually an electronic sample mixed with a real kick drum, blended together and put through some reverb, and also kind of added through some sort of heavy compressor that's kind of bringing out the harmonic content and distorting it slightly. And this is why I've called it smash ambience, is that there's quite a bit of distortion to it. And what this should do is it should reinforce the kind of ambience and the sustain of the sound. So let's put these other samples back in, and I'm just going to slowly blend in this kick smash. So that feels pretty good, and how I worked with that is that I just kept incrementally bringing it up until I felt it was too much, and then backed it back down. And we'll probably find when we get the rest of the kit in that we want to kind of fine tune that a bit more, but hopefully when I was taking it on and off you were hearing just that extra weight and the length there, but without it kind of colouring the sound too much that it sounds like a different drum entirely. So let's do the same process with the snare here, and I'm going to leave the kick sample in so that I can kind of balance the two off each other. Again, I'm going to go to one shots, ambience, and snare ambience. Great. So that feels pretty good, and what we're going to do now is just solo that so you can hear what this sounds naturally like. Okay, so what you're hearing there is just a little bit more of a longer, denser reverb than one was on the kit. The one that was on the kick drum was a kind of shorter ambience, and this is much longer, much brighter. And again, the same sort of approach. There's a couple of electronic samples blended with a real acoustic snare drum. So you're getting some of the extra sustain out of the electronic samples, and you're getting some of the punch out of the natural one, and that's all blended through reverbs and distortions again. So let's just quickly add those back together, and so you can kind of hear what that's like with the overheads and the toms in there as well. And let's put these close mic snares back in. So hopefully what you've noticed there is that it kind of gives it this extra weight, this extra consistency, but it doesn't really mask the natural sound of the drums too much, which is really where I like to start from. Okay, let's just quickly, because this section has quite a bit of floor tom, let's just go ahead and let's load in the floor tom here. Okay, great. And let's just put the rest of the channels in with the cymbals and some extra room ambience and see what it sounds like. And now let's take out the samples. Okay, so hopefully you're really noticing how the shells of the kit really kind of come forward, but in a way that's consistent and not in a way that changes the overall tone too much. So the next thing I want to show you is actually the metal sample. So that was the rock kit. Let's just go ahead and load the metal ones. So I'm just going to clear all of these. I did that by holding the Alt key. And let's just load the metal kick here. So let's start with that. Notice that that one's a lot punchier, a lot tighter to begin with. So you'll notice that there's no longer room mics on this particular sample. And there's also a different mic selection. So rather than having a sub kick on the metal kit, usually what you find is when drummers are doing lots of double bass pedals and the tempo is faster, that you don't have room for that extra sub and it just mushes and muddies things up. So we haven't used one here. And the mic choice on the kick in is also very different. So on the rock kit, it was a D12, a classic AKG dynamic mic, known for being, you know, a bit pre-EQ'd but not so drastic. Whereas on this metal kick, it was an Audix D6, which is known for just being a little bit clickier and more punchy, okay, a bit more aggressive. So you probably heard that difference there. But again, I haven't gone through and maybe treated it to the extreme top end boost that you're likely to find on a lot of canned samples. So if we go through and listen to that, you'll find that it's not got that like big smacky modern metal thing just quite yet. So just have a listen. Okay, so it's really nice and punchy, but let me just show you what I prepared earlier, which is an SSL E strip, and I've just put that level of top end and bottom end that you might expect from a more metal kick drum. So let me just solo that. And now blend that in. Notice that the sample by itself maybe feels a little bit too much, but when it's blended in with the others that are a bit more neutral, you'll notice that you're getting a lot of punch and it's almost exaggerating that side. Okay, and one other thing to notice about these metal samples that I've done is I actually left the snare on when we were taking the shells of the kit, and the reason is on a lot of these canned samples, they're doing each part on their own, maybe without even the toms or the snare, you know, as part of the kit at that time. And sometimes in a lot of kind of metal music, you end up with a very processed, artificial sounding drum kit that is very obviously triggered. And when I made these with it in mind that I wanted to kind of have a little bit of that extra bleed in them so that it felt a little bit more natural, because sometimes that's what I was feeling I was lacking from a lot of these samples. So when I was playing that, you could probably hear just some of that snare rattle going on in it as well. Just listen for that one more time. it's subtle, but it's there. And actually on the racks and the floors, there's actually, as part of this set, there's 4 toms, there's 2 racks and 2 floors, and you can hear some of the snare rattles in those. And what that does is it gives you a little bit more of a natural feeling to them, even though they're samples. And that for me is a really good variation on what's already out there. So let's go ahead and let's do the same thing to the snare here. And it's the same thing here with this snare drum. It's not overly processed, so you might want some more top end. So again, just something that I've done a bit earlier, I'm adding quite a considerable amount of top end. And that's something that you're likely to hear on modern American radio rock. It's also something that you're likely to hear on a lot of metal music as well. So let's just hear those triggers on, and then I'm going to turn off these EQs. So just a tiny bit more pillowy when they're off, and a little bit more natural, and a little bit more like classic rock. And when the EQs are turned on, it's much more aggressive and modern and in your face. So let's just do the same test again. I'm just going to play you these and then turn off these kick and snare samples. Okay, so that's some of the ways that I like to use my own custom drum samples to help get a consistent punch and get some ambience and overall sustain out of the drums. Again, if you would like to get these drum samples for free, please go to audioproductiontips.com and go to the free stuff page. And if you haven't watched the video on using drum samples to recover ambience, I'll put it on the screen again now. Please leave some comments, please subscribe, and if you have any questions or would like to have a video on how I actually make these drum samples and use the Trigger instrument editor, please ask away.